The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg still lingered in my kitchen when my daughter delivered the words that would change everything between us. I had spent 14 hours preparing what I thought would be the perfect Thanksgiving dinner using my late wife's treasured recipes that had been passed down through 3 generations. But as my daughter pushed away her barely touched plate and rolled her eyes at her husband, she said something that cut deeper than any knife I'd ever used in that kitchen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Walter Hoffman, and I'm 71 years old. I live in the same 2-story house in Millbrook where I raised my family, where my wife Margaret and I built 43 years of memories before cancer took her away 2 years ago. The house feels too big now, with its 4 empty bedrooms and a dining room that rarely sees more than one place setting. But I stay because this is where Margaret's presence feels strongest, especially in the kitchen where she taught me everything I know about cooking. Margaret was the heart of our family's culinary tradition. Her grandmother Elena had brought recipes from Sicily when she immigrated to America in 1923, carefully writing them down in broken English mixed with Italian notes that only family could decipher. These recipes weren't just instructions for food preparation. They were love letters written in measurements of flour and pinches of herbs, stories told through the careful layering of flavors that spoke of homeland, sacrifice, and the desire to nourish those you care about most. When Margaret fell ill, she made me promise to keep these recipes alive, not just to cook them, but to understand them, to feel them in my hands the way she did. She would sit in her chair by the kitchen window during those final months, her voice growing weaker, but her passion for cooking never dimming as she walked me through the subtle techniques that couldn't be found in any cookbook. How to tell when the dough for her famous ravioli had been kneaded enough by the way it felt against your palm. How the aroma would change when the tomato sauce reached that perfect moment of readiness. How to adjust the seasoning in her legendary meatballs not by measuring spoons, but by trusting your instincts and tasting with your heart. After Margaret passed, cooking became my way of staying connected to her, to our family history, and to the woman who had made our house a home. Every Sunday, I would prepare her tomato sauce, letting it simmer for hours while I worked in the garden or read by the window. The familiar ritual brought comfort, and the taste transported me back to happier times when our dining room was filled with laughter, conversation, and the satisfied sighs of people who had been truly fed. My daughter Sophia inherited her mother's beauty, but not her warmth. At 34, she had built a successful career as a marketing executive in the city, married a successful attorney named Derek, and lived in a modern home that looked like it belonged in a magazine rather than being lived in by real people. They had no children, claiming they were too focused on their careers, too busy building their empire to be bothered with the messiness of family life. Since Margaret's death, my relationship with Sophia had become increasingly strained. She would visit occasionally, usually when she needed something, and her visits were filled with suggestions about how I should modernize my life. She thought I should move to a retirement community, sell the house, update my wardrobe, and generally transform myself into someone more acceptable to her social circle. She seemed embarrassed by my simple lifestyle, my contentment with small pleasures, my dedication to preserving traditions she viewed as outdated and irrelevant. This particular Thanksgiving had been planned for weeks. Sophia and Derek lived 3 hours away, and she had called in October to inform me that they would grace me with their presence for the holiday. Not ask if I wanted them to visit, not inquire about what would work best for my schedule, but inform me of their decision as if I should be grateful for the honor of hosting them. I was grateful, despite her tone. Margaret had always said that family was everything, that love meant showing up even when it was inconvenient, even when relationships were complicated. So I threw myself into preparing what I intended to be a perfect Thanksgiving feast, one that would honor Margaret's memory and perhaps bridge the growing distance between my daughter and me. I spent days planning the menu, carefully reviewing Margaret's handwritten recipe cards that were stained with decades of use and love. I would make her famous turkey with herb stuffing, the sweet potato casserole that had been requested at every family gathering for 20 years, the green bean almondine that Margaret had perfected after years of experimentation, and of course, her legendary pumpkin pie with the secret ingredient that she had never shared with anyone outside our immediate family. The preparation began 3 days before Thanksgiving. I made the turkey stock from scratch, roasting bones and vegetables until the entire house smelled like comfort and tradition. I prepared the cranberry sauce using fresh berries and the exact combination of orange zest and cinnamon that Margaret had developed through years of refinement. I made the pie crust from scratch, rolling it out on the same marble board that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother, feeling the connection to generations of women who had nourished their families with their own hands. On Thanksgiving morning, I was up at 5 a.m., moving through the kitchen with the precision of a conductor leading a familiar symphony. The turkey went into the oven first, basted with butter and herbs, its skin already beginning to turn that perfect golden brown that Margaret had taught me to achieve. The sweet potato casserole followed, its surface dotted with marshmallows that would caramelize into perfection. The stuffing, made with day-old bread, celery, sage, and turkey stock, filled the house with an aroma that transported me back to every Thanksgiving we had ever celebrated together. By 12, everything was progressing beautifully. The turkey was golden and nearly done, its internal temperature climbing toward the perfect 165 degrees that would ensure moist, flavorful meat. The side dishes were warming in the oven, each one prepared exactly as Margaret had taught me, with the care and attention that transformed simple ingredients into expressions of love. I set the dining room table with Margaret's good china, the set we had received as a wedding gift and saved for special occasions. I polished the silver, arranged fresh flowers from my garden as a centerpiece, and set out the cloth napkins that Margaret had embroidered during the early years of our marriage. Every detail was perfect, every element chosen to create an atmosphere of warmth, tradition, and family connection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sophia kissed my cheek with the sort of polite affection reserved for distant acquaintances, while Derek offered a firm handshake and a professional smile that never reached his eyes. "The house smells interesting," Sophia commented, her tone suggesting that interesting was not necessarily a compliment. She walked through the living room, her critical gaze taking inventory of furniture that had been perfectly acceptable for 40 years, but suddenly seemed shabby under her scrutiny. Derek remained near the entrance, still scrolling through his phone, apparently unable to disconnect from work even on a national holiday. I had hoped for a few minutes of conversation, some catching up on their lives, perhaps some shared memories of previous Thanksgivings when Margaret was still alive and the house was filled with warmth and laughter. Instead, Sophia immediately began commenting on things that needed to be updated, changed, or replaced. The living room furniture was outdated, the wallpaper was too busy, the hardwood floors could use refinishing, and wouldn't I be so much happier in a nice retirement community where I wouldn't have to worry about maintaining such a large house? I listened politely, nodding at appropriate moments, while internally counting down the minutes until dinner would be ready and we could focus on the meal I had worked so hard to prepare. Margaret had always been better at managing Sophia's criticism, deflecting her comments with humor or redirecting her attention to more positive topics. Without Margaret's diplomatic skills, I felt clumsy and defensive, unsure how to respond to my daughter's relentless suggestions for improvement. At 2:15, I announced that dinner was ready. I had timed everything perfectly, allowing the turkey to rest while I finished the gravy and warmed the rolls. The dining room looked beautiful, set with care and attention to every detail that might create a sense of occasion and family celebration. We gathered around the table, and I offered to say grace, a tradition that Margaret and I had maintained throughout our marriage. Sophia and Derek exchanged a look, the kind of silent communication that passes between couples who share the same opinion about something they find slightly ridiculous. But they bowed their heads and endured my brief prayer of gratitude, family, food, and the memory of those no longer with us. I carved the turkey at the table, just as my father had done when I was a child, just as I had done when Sophia was small, and would watch with fascination as I transformed the whole bird into perfectly sliced portions. The meat was beautiful, golden and juicy, falling away from the knife in thick, perfect slices that I arranged on the serving platter with the pride of an artist displaying his masterpiece. For a few minutes, there was the pleasant silence of people focused on filling their plates, the soft sounds of serving spoons against ceramic dishes, the gentle clink of silverware against china. I watched Sophia and Derek sample each dish, hoping to see some sign of appreciation, some recognition of the effort and love that had gone into every element of the meal. The turkey was perfectly cooked, moist and flavorful, seasoned with the herb mixture that Margaret had developed over years of experimentation. The stuffing was rich and savory, each bite containing the complex layers of flavor that only come from careful preparation and quality ingredients. The sweet potato casserole was creamy and sweet, topped with marshmallows that had caramelized to perfection. The green bean almondine was crisp and fresh, the almonds toasted to exactly the right shade of golden brown. But as I watched my guests eat, I noticed something troubling. Neither Sophia nor Derek seemed to be enjoying the food. They ate mechanically, without pleasure, occasionally making polite sounds of approval that felt forced and insincere. Derek spent more time checking his phone than focusing on his plate, and Sophia seemed distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. I tried to start conversations about their work, their recent travels, their plans for the upcoming holidays. Derek responded with brief, professional answers that provided information without revealing anything meaningful about his life or interests. Sophia was slightly more engaged, but her responses were peppered with complaints about her job, her colleagues, the traffic on the drive up, the weather, and various other inconveniences that apparently made her life quite difficult. As the meal progressed, I began to notice that both Sophia and Derek were eating very small portions, moving food around their plates more than actually consuming it. The turkey, which I knew was delicious, seemed to be causing Derek some difficulty. He chewed slowly, his expression suggesting that he was enduring rather than enjoying his food. Sophia took a few bites of the sweet potato casserole, then set down her fork and didn't return to it. My heart began to sink as I realized that my carefully prepared feast was not being received with the appreciation I had hoped for. These were recipes that had brought joy to family gatherings for decades, dishes that Margaret had perfected through years of careful refinement, flavors that represented the best of our family's culinary tradition. But my daughter and son-in-law were treating them like an obligation to be endured rather than a gift to be savored. I tried to salvage the mood by sharing stories about the recipes, explaining how Margaret's grandmother had brought them from Italy, how each dish had evolved over the generations, how much love and history was represented in every bite. But Sophia seemed bored by these stories, checking her own phone while I spoke, and Derek's attention was clearly divided between his meal and whatever urgent matters required his immediate attention. The final blow came when I brought out the pumpkin pie, Margaret's crowning achievement, the dessert that had been requested at every family gathering, the recipe that she had guarded like a state secret, sharing it only with me during her final months. I had spent hours preparing it, carefully measuring each ingredient, adjusting the spice blend to match Margaret's exact specifications, ensuring that the texture was silky and the flavor was perfect. I cut 3 generous slices, serving them on Margaret's favorite dessert plates, the delicate porcelain ones with tiny painted flowers that she had inherited from her mother. I waited for their first bites, anticipating the moment when they would taste the familiar flavors and perhaps remember happier Thanksgivings when Margaret was still alive and our family felt more like a family. Derek took a small bite, chewed thoughtfully, and nodded politely. Sophia took a larger bite, and I watched her expression carefully, hoping to see some sign of recognition, some acknowledgement of the love and tradition represented in that perfect slice of pie. Instead, she set down her fork after that single bite and reached for her water glass. The silence stretched uncomfortably. I took a bite of my own pie, confirming what I already knew. It was exactly as Margaret had made it, rich and spiced and perfect, a fitting conclusion to a meal prepared with care and love. But my guests were not sharing my appreciation, and the atmosphere in the room had become strained.
I tried to fill the silence with more stories, reminiscing about previous Thanksgivings when Sophia was young, when she would help Margaret in the kitchen, when she would ask for second helpings of everything and declare each dish the best thing she had ever tasted. But even these memories seemed to annoy her, as if I was holding her accountable for a childhood enthusiasm she had long since outgrown. Derek excused himself to take a phone call, disappearing into the living room where I could hear him discussing some urgent legal matter that apparently couldn't wait until after the holiday. Sophia and I sat alone at the dining room table, surrounded by the remnants of my carefully prepared feast, the silence between us heavy with unspoken criticism and disappointment. Finally, she spoke, and her words shattered whatever hope I had maintained for a pleasant family gathering. "Dad," she said, her tone carrying the sort of forced patience usually reserved for explaining something obvious to someone particularly slow to understand, "I think we need to talk about your cooking." I felt a chill run through me, a premonition that whatever she was about to say would be painful and difficult to hear. But I nodded, encouraging her to continue, hoping that perhaps she had some constructive feedback that would help me improve, some insight that might bridge the gap between us. "This meal," she continued, gesturing vaguely at the table, "it's just not very good."
The turkey was dry, the stuffing was soggy, and everything tasted bland. I know you're trying, but honestly, Dad, you cook like someone who learned from watching cooking shows for homeless people. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and leaving me stunned in my chair. I had spent 3 days preparing this meal, using recipes that had been perfected over generations, techniques that Margaret had taught me with patience and love. I had tasted everything, adjusted seasonings, monitored temperatures, paid attention to every detail that might affect the final result. The meal was not perfect, perhaps, but it was good, made with quality ingredients and careful attention to traditional methods. But more than the insult to my cooking was the casual cruelty of her comparison. Homeless people. As if preparing food with limited resources somehow made a person less worthy of respect. As if the circumstances of someone's life determined the value of their efforts to nourish themselves and others. The comment revealed something ugly about my daughter's character. A callousness that I had not recognized before and did not want to acknowledge now. "I'm sorry you didn't enjoy it," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "I thought it turned out quite well." Sophia sighed, the kind of exaggerated expression of frustration that suggested I was being deliberately obtuse. "Dad, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings, but someone needs to be honest with you. You're living in the past, clinging to these old recipes that nobody wants to eat anymore. The world has moved on. Food has evolved. People expect something more sophisticated, more refined than this heavy, old-fashioned stuff." She was talking about Margaret's recipes, the dishes that had been our family's signature for 3 generations, the flavors that had defined every celebration and brought comfort during difficult times. She was dismissing not just my cooking, but our entire culinary heritage, as if decades of family tradition were nothing more than outdated inconvenience. Derek returned from his phone call, sliding his phone into his pocket with the satisfied expression of someone who had just resolved an important matter. He glanced at our faces, clearly sensing the tension that had developed in his absence, but chose not to inquire about its source. "Are we ready to go?" he asked Sophia, checking his watch. "We should probably leave soon if we want to avoid the traffic." They had been in my home for less than 3 hours, spent perhaps 45 minutes at the dinner table, and were already eager to leave. The realization that they viewed this visit as an obligation to be completed as quickly as possible rather than an opportunity to spend time together added another layer of pain to an already difficult afternoon. Sophia stood immediately, apparently relieved to have an excuse to end our conversation. "Yes," she said, "we should head out. Thank you for dinner, Dad." She leaned down to kiss my cheek again, the same polite, distant gesture she had offered when they arrived. Derek shook my hand, thanked me for the meal with professional courtesy, and followed Sophia toward the door. I walked them out, standing on the porch as they settled into their luxury car, watching as Derek started the engine and backed out of my driveway without looking back. I remained on the porch long after their car had disappeared, feeling the November cold seep through my shirt, listening to the silence that seemed deeper and more profound than before they had arrived. The house behind me was filled with the remnants of my failed attempt to recreate the family gatherings of happier times. Dirty dishes waited in the kitchen, leftovers that would feed me for a week, and the lingering aromas of a meal that had been rejected and criticized. But worse than the practical aftermath was the emotional devastation of my daughter's words. "You cook like someone who learned from watching cooking shows for homeless people." The phrase echoed in my mind, each repetition adding fresh pain to an already wounded heart. She had not just criticized my cooking. She had dismissed my efforts to maintain family traditions, rejected the love and care I had put into every dish, and revealed a contempt for people less fortunate that spoke poorly of her character and values. I walked back into the house, closing the door behind me, and stood in the dining room looking at the table that had been set with such hope and care just hours earlier. Margaret's good china was stained with the remnants of rejected food. The flowers I had arranged were already beginning to wilt, and the atmosphere of celebration I had worked so hard to create had been replaced by a heavy sadness that seemed to fill every corner of the room. As I began to clear the table, carefully scraping uneaten food into containers for the refrigerator, I found myself remembering Margaret's final months when she had been so determined to pass on these recipes, so worried that our family's culinary traditions would die with her. She had made me promise to keep them alive, to continue preparing these dishes, to share them with Sophia and any grandchildren who might someday want to learn about their heritage. But Sophia had made it clear that she had no interest in preserving these traditions. She viewed them as embarrassing reminders of a simpler time that she had outgrown and left behind. The recipes that Margaret had treasured were nothing more than outdated inconveniences to her daughter, old-fashioned cooking that had no place in her sophisticated modern life. I finished clearing the table and loading the dishwasher, moving through the familiar motions while my mind struggled to process what had happened and what it meant for my relationship with my daughter. The physical work was soothing, providing a distraction from the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm me. But even these simple tasks reminded me of Margaret and the countless holiday meals we had cleaned up together, laughing about family quirks and planning improvements for next year's feast. But there would be no improvements for next year's feast. Sophia had made her feelings clear, and I could not imagine subjecting myself to another afternoon of criticism and rejection, another attempt to share something meaningful only to have it dismissed and ridiculed. As evening fell and the house grew dark around me, I sat in Margaret's chair by the kitchen window, the same spot where she had spent her final months teaching me these recipes, sharing stories about her grandmother, and expressing her hope that our family's culinary traditions would continue long after she was gone. But traditions require willing participants, people who value the past enough to carry it forward, families who understand that recipes are more than just instructions for preparing food. Looking back on that Thanksgiving evening, I realize that was the moment when everything began to change. Sitting alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the aftermath of my daughter's rejection, I began to understand that preserving Margaret's legacy might require something more dramatic than simply continuing to cook her recipes for family members who did not appreciate them. The seeds of what would eventually become my decision were planted that night. In the darkness of my kitchen, as I contemplated the cruel words my daughter had spoken and the dismissive way she had treated not just my cooking, but the entire heritage that Margaret had been so determined to preserve. Sometimes, the people we love most are the least capable of recognizing the value of what we offer them.
And sometimes preserving something precious requires the courage to share it with people who will truly appreciate its worth.
But that realization would come later, along with the decision that would ultimately change everything about my relationship with my daughter and my understanding of what it really means to honor the memory of someone you love. For now, I simply sat in the darkness, feeling the weight of rejection and disappointment, and wondering how Margaret's beautiful recipes had become weapons used to wound rather than gifts intended to nourish and connect. The night stretched ahead of me, long and quiet, filled with the echo of cruel words and the lingering aromas of a feast that had been prepared with love but received with indifference. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new choices, and eventually a decision that would surprise everyone who thought they understood what kind of man I was and how far I was willing to go to protect something precious. But tonight, I simply grieved for the family gathering that had failed, the traditions that had been rejected, and the relationship with my daughter that seemed to grow more distant with each passing interaction. Margaret had always believed that love could overcome any obstacle, that family bonds were strong enough to weather any storm. But she had never had to face the particular cruelty of having something precious ridiculed and dismissed by the very person who should have cherished it most. The following morning arrived, gray and cold, matching the heaviness that had settled in my chest since Sophia's departure. I woke before dawn, as had become my habit since Margaret's passing, and made my way to the kitchen, where the remnants of yesterday's disaster still lingered in the refrigerator. Containers of rejected food sat stacked on the shelves, silent testimony to my failed attempt at family reconciliation. I made coffee in the same ceramic mug I had used for 20 years, the one Margaret had bought me for Father's Day when Sophia was still in high school. Back then, she would bound down the stairs on weekend mornings, her hair tousled from sleep, and steal sips of my coffee while chattering about school friends, weekend plans, and the small dramas that seemed monumentally important to a teenager. Those mornings felt like memories from someone else's life now. As I sat at the kitchen table, watching the sunrise paint the backyard in shades of amber and rose, my mind kept returning to Sophia's words. "You cook like someone who learned from watching cooking shows for homeless people." The casual cruelty of it still took my breath away. Not just the insult to my cooking, but the underlying contempt for people struggling with hardship, as if their circumstances made them somehow less deserving of respect or dignity. Margaret would have been horrified. During our marriage, she had volunteered at the local food bank every Saturday morning, helping to prepare meals for anyone who needed them. She never distinguished between the deserving and undeserving poor, never judged people for their circumstances or questioned their worthiness of a hot meal. Her philosophy was simple. Everyone deserves to be fed with dignity, and food prepared with care has the power to restore not just the body, but the spirit. After her diagnosis, when the chemotherapy made it difficult for her to continue volunteering, she had asked me to take her place. For the past 2 years, every Saturday morning had found me at St. Andrew's Community Center, working alongside a group of dedicated volunteers to prepare hundreds of meals for people facing food insecurity. Some were homeless, some were working families stretched too thin by medical bills or job loss, some were elderly people choosing between medication and groceries. What struck me most about this work was not the gratitude of those we served, though that was meaningful, but the skill and creativity of my fellow volunteers. Many were professional chefs who donated their time. Others were home cooks like myself, who understood that preparing food for people in need required the same care and attention as cooking for your own family. The meals we served were not institutional food, but thoughtfully prepared dishes made from quality ingredients donated by local restaurants and grocery stores. Maria Santos, the head volunteer coordinator, had been a chef at upscale restaurants for 30 years before retiring to focus on community service. She taught me techniques I had never learned from Margaret, showed me how to stretch ingredients without sacrificing flavor, how to prepare large quantities while maintaining quality. Under her guidance, I had become a better cook, more confident in my abilities, and more adventurous in my approach to different cuisines. The irony of Sophia's insult was particularly bitter because some of the best meals I had ever eaten were prepared in that community center kitchen. Food made with limited resources but unlimited heart. Dishes that demonstrated how skill and compassion could transform simple ingredients into something extraordinary. The people who learned to cook under such constraints often possessed a creativity and resourcefulness that put more privileged cooks to shame. As these thoughts churned through my mind, I found myself growing increasingly angry, not just hurt by Sophia's rejection of my cooking, but genuinely outraged by her attitude toward people less fortunate than herself. When had my daughter become someone capable of such callousness? When did she develop the sort of casual contempt for struggling people that allowed her to use homelessness as a punchline? I spent the morning mechanically going through household tasks, trying to distract myself from the emotional turmoil, but every activity reminded me of Margaret and the traditions Sophia had so dismissively rejected. Folding laundry, I found the apron Margaret had used while teaching me her recipes. Dusting the living room, I noticed the cookbook collection she had assembled over 40 years of marriage, each volume marked with handwritten notes and modifications. Even mundane tasks became painful reminders of everything my daughter seemed determined to forget or dismiss. By afternoon, restlessness had replaced anger. I needed to get out of the house, away from the memories and the lingering disappointment of yesterday's failed gathering. I decided to drive to Henderson Park, where Margaret and I had often walked during the early years of our marriage when we were still discovering the rhythms of life together. The park was nearly empty on this cold November day, just a few determined joggers and dog walkers braving the wind. I followed the familiar path around the pond, remembering summer evenings when this place had been alive with families feeding ducks, couples sharing picnics on the grass. Margaret loved this park, especially in spring when the cherry trees bloomed and the air was sweet with the promise of renewal. It was here, sitting on our favorite bench overlooking the water, that I encountered Bernard Kowalski. Bernie was roughly my age, a retired mathematics professor who had moved to Millbrook 5 years ago after his wife passed away. We had met occasionally at the library and exchanged pleasantries, but had never engaged in serious conversation. Today, however, something about his presence felt welcoming, and when he nodded towards the empty space beside him on the bench, I gratefully accepted the invitation. Bernie had the sort of face that inspired confidence, weathered but kind, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was feeding breadcrumbs to a small flock of ducks that had gathered hopefully at the water's edge, apparently unfazed by the cold weather. "Tough day?" he asked without looking at me, his voice carrying the sort of gentle inquiry that suggested he understood difficult emotions without needing explanation. "Tough holiday," I replied, surprised by my willingness to share even that much with someone who was essentially a stranger. Bernie nodded knowingly.
Holidays have a way of highlighting what's missing from our lives. First Thanksgiving without my wife 5 years ago nearly did me in. Couldn't understand why everyone else seemed so cheerful when my world had fallen apart. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the ducks paddle around the pond, listening to the wind rustle through the bare branches above us. There was something therapeutic about Bernie's presence, the way he offered companionship without pressure, understanding without judgment. "What made it better?" I asked eventually. "The holidays, I mean. How did you get through them?" Bernie scattered the last of his breadcrumbs and folded the empty bag carefully before answering. I stopped trying to recreate what I'd lost and started creating something new. Took me 3 years to figure that out, but it made all the difference. He turned to look at me directly, and I could see genuine curiosity in his expression. What happened yesterday? Something about his manner made confession feel safe, even necessary. I found myself telling him about the elaborate Thanksgiving dinner I had prepared, about Sophia's cruel comparison, about my growing realization that my daughter saw me as an embarrassment rather than a father worth respecting. Bernie listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his expression growing more thoughtful as my story progressed. "She said I cooked like someone who learned from cooking shows for homeless people," I concluded, the words still painful to speak aloud. Bernie was quiet for a long moment, processing what I had shared. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of indignation that surprised me. "That's not just an insult to you," he said firmly. "That's an insult to every person who's ever struggled to put food on the table, every volunteer who's ever worked in a soup kitchen, every chef who's ever tried to create something beautiful from limited resources. Your daughter revealed something ugly about her character with that comment." His validation of my feelings was both comforting and energizing. For 24 hours, I had been questioning whether my reaction was too sensitive, whether I was overreacting to what Sophia might claim was just an unfortunate choice of words. But Bernie's immediate recognition of the cruelty involved confirmed what I had instinctively understood. This was not just about cooking, but about values, respect, and basic human decency. "Tell me about these recipes," Bernie said, settling back on the bench as if he had all the time in the world. "They must be special if you put so much effort into preparing them." I found myself describing Margaret's culinary heritage, the Sicilian grandmother who had brought these recipes to America, the generations of refinement that had perfected each dish. Bernie listened with the sort of focused attention that made me feel heard and valued, asking thoughtful questions about techniques and ingredients, expressing genuine interest in the history and tradition behind each recipe. "You know," he said when I had finished, "I've eaten in some of the finest restaurants in the world, but the most memorable meals have always been the ones prepared with love and tradition. What you're describing sounds like culinary treasure, the kind of authentic family cooking that most people only dream about experiencing." His words were like salve on a wound I had not fully acknowledged. After Sophia's rejection, I had begun to doubt not just my cooking skills, but the value of the traditions Margaret had worked so hard to preserve. Bernie's appreciation reminded me that the problem was not with the recipes or my preparation, but with my daughter's inability to recognize something precious when it was offered to her. We talked for nearly 2 hours, our conversation ranging from cooking to loss, from family disappointments to the challenge of finding purpose in later life. Bernie had his own stories of difficult adult children, of traditions rejected by a younger generation more interested in convenience than heritage, of the loneliness that comes with outliving the people who shared your memories and values. As the afternoon light began to fade, Bernie made a suggestion that would prove to be pivotal. "There's a farmer's market downtown every Saturday morning," he said. "Real farmers, real local produce, people who appreciate quality ingredients and traditional cooking methods. You might enjoy checking it out. Different crowd than what you're used to, but they understand the value of food prepared with care." I thanked him for the suggestion and for the conversation, feeling lighter than I had since Sophia's visit. Bernie had reminded me that my daughter's opinion was not the final word on the value of what Margaret had left me, that there were people in the world who would appreciate the traditions she had dismissed so casually. That evening, I found myself in the kitchen again, not out of habit this time, but with purpose. I pulled out Margaret's recipe box, running my fingers over the familiar index cards, remembering her patient instruction as she had taught me each dish. These recipes represented more than just food preparation. They were a connection to family history, expressions of love, links to a heritage that Sophia might reject, but that others might treasure. I made a decision that night, sitting at my kitchen table with Margaret's recipes spread before me. If my daughter did not appreciate these treasures, perhaps it was time to find people who would. Not despite Sophia, but to honor Margaret's memory by ensuring that her culinary legacy found a home where it would be valued and preserved. The farmer's market Bernie had mentioned was just the beginning. I began to imagine a larger possibility, a way to transform rejection into purpose, to turn my daughter's cruelty into motivation for something positive and meaningful. Margaret's recipes deserved better than to be dismissed as outdated irrelevance. They deserved to be shared with people who understood that food prepared with love and tradition was one of life's greatest gifts. Over the next few days, I began researching the local food scene, reading about restaurants that specialized in traditional family recipes, learning about the growing movement toward authentic, heritage cooking. I discovered that many chefs were actively seeking traditional family recipes, willing to pay substantial sums for authentic dishes with compelling stories behind them. The more I learned, the more excited I became about the possibilities.
Margaret's recipes were not just family treasures, but potentially valuable culinary assets, dishes that represented authentic Sicilian cooking, refined through generations of American adaptation. The pumpkin pie recipe alone, with its secret ingredient and unique preparation method, could be worth thousands of dollars to the right restaurant or food company. I found myself staying up late, writing down not just the recipes, but the stories behind them, the family history that gave them context and meaning. Each dish had its own narrative. The ravioli recipe that Margaret's grandmother had adapted when she could not find the right type of cheese in America. The tomato sauce that had evolved over decades as different family members added their own refinements. The meatball technique that had been passed down through 4 generations of Sicilian women. These stories transformed the recipes from simple cooking instructions into cultural documents, preserving not just flavors but history, tradition, and family identity. I began to understand that what Sophia had rejected was not just food but heritage, not just cooking but culture, not just recipes but the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had nourished their families with skill, love, and pride. The realization was both painful and liberating. Painful because it confirmed that my daughter had grown so disconnected from her own heritage that she could dismiss it as worthless. Liberating because it freed me from the obligation to preserve these traditions for someone who did not appreciate them, allowing me to consider sharing them with people who would recognize their true value. By the end of the week, I had made a decision that would have shocked Sophia if she had known about it. I was going to sell Margaret's recipes, not out of spite or revenge, but as an act of preservation and respect. Rather than letting them die with me or be rejected by a daughter who saw them as embarrassing relics, I would ensure they lived on in the hands of people who understood their worth. The decision felt like a betrayal at first, but as I thought about it more deeply, I realized it was actually the ultimate act of loyalty to Margaret's memory. She had wanted these recipes to continue bringing joy to people who appreciated good food. She had wanted them to be valued and preserved, not dismissed and forgotten. If Sophia was unwilling to carry forward this legacy, then I would find others who would. I began making phone calls, reaching out to local restaurants, food magazines, and culinary schools. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Traditional family recipes from Sicily, refined through generations of American adaptation, were exactly what many chefs were seeking. Several restaurants expressed interest in featuring authentic heritage dishes on their menus, and 2 food magazines wanted to publish the stories behind the recipes. But the most intriguing response came from Antonio Mercelli, the executive chef at Nona's Table, a high-end Italian restaurant in the city. When I described Margaret's collection, particularly the unique pumpkin pie recipe and the distinctive meatball technique, Antonio asked if he could meet with me in person to discuss a potential partnership. Nona's Table was the kind of restaurant that Sophia and Derek probably frequented, the sort of upscale establishment that charged $50 for pasta dishes and prided itself on authentic Italian cuisine. The irony was not lost on me that my daughter might very well end up eating Margaret's food at this restaurant, paying premium prices for the very recipes she had dismissed as the cooking of homeless people. Antonio turned out to be a passionate advocate for traditional cooking, a second-generation Italian-American who had spent years researching authentic regional recipes from Italy. He understood immediately the value of what Margaret had preserved, not just as recipes but as cultural artifacts that told the story of Italian immigration and adaptation in America. When I showed Margaret's handwritten cards with their careful notes about American ingredient substitutions and generational refinements, his eyes lit up with genuine excitement. "This is exactly what we're looking for," he said, handling the cards with the reverence due to precious documents. "These aren't just recipes, they're cultural history. The story of how your wife's family adapted traditional Sicilian cooking to American ingredients and tastes, that's the kind of authentic narrative that makes food meaningful." We spent 3 hours going through Margaret's collection, with Antonio asking detailed questions about preparation methods,
ingredient sources, and the stories behind each dish. He was particularly intrigued by the pumpkin pie recipe, which represented a unique fusion of Italian technique with American seasonal ingredients, creating something entirely new while maintaining traditional flavor profiles. By the end of our meeting, Antonio had made an offer that took my breath away. He wanted to purchase exclusive rights to 6 of Margaret's recipes, including the famous pumpkin pie, for $50,000. Additionally, he wanted to hire me as a consultant to ensure the dishes were prepared exactly as Margaret had taught me, with full attribution to her memory and our family's heritage. The financial offer was significant enough to secure my retirement and ensure I never had to worry about money again. But more important was Antonio's promise to honor Margaret's legacy by preparing her recipes with the same care and respect she had shown them, by sharing the stories behind the dishes with customers who would appreciate their cultural significance. I asked for a week to consider his offer, though I already knew what my answer would be. This was more than just a business transaction. It was an opportunity to ensure that Margaret's culinary legacy lived on in the hands of someone who truly understood its value. Someone who would prepare her dishes with skill and respect, rather than dismissing them as outdated irrelevance. That night, I called Bernie to share the developments of the past week. He listened with growing amazement as I described Antonio's offer and the possibilities it represented. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Your wife would be proud," he said finally. "You found a way to honor her memory that goes beyond just keeping recipes in the family. You're ensuring they'll be prepared and appreciated by people who understand their true value." His words confirmed what I had been feeling, but had not quite been able to articulate. This was not about punishing Sophia for her cruelty, though there was a certain satisfaction in the thought that she might someday unknowingly pay premium prices for the food she had scorned. This was about fulfilling the promise I had made to Margaret, ensuring that her recipes continued to bring joy and nourishment to people who appreciated good food prepared with love and tradition. I made one final decision before accepting Antonio's offer. I would give Sophia one last chance to reclaim her heritage, one final opportunity to apologize for her cruelty and express interest in learning Margaret's recipes. Not because I expected her to change, but because I wanted to be certain I was making this decision for the right reasons. The phone call I made to her that Sunday evening was brief and pointed. I explained that I had received interest from professional chefs in purchasing Margaret's recipes, and I wanted to give her the opportunity to learn them herself if she had reconsidered their value. Her response was everything I had expected and dreaded. She laughed, actually laughed at the suggestion that anyone would pay money for what she called my old-fashioned cooking. She told me I was being ridiculous, that no legitimate chef would be interested in recipes that produced such mediocre results, and that I should stop living in the past and learn to cook food that people actually wanted to eat. When I mentioned the specific offer from Nona's table, her laughter stopped abruptly.
She knew the restaurant, had eaten there with Derek on special occasions, and the idea that they would want recipes from her father's kitchen clearly challenged her assumptions about the quality of my cooking. But rather than reconsidering her position, she doubled down on her criticism. "If they're actually interested in buying those recipes," she said, "then you should absolutely sell them. Take whatever money you can get and use it to take some proper cooking classes. Learn to make food that doesn't taste like it came from a soup kitchen." There it was again. The casual cruelty, the reflexive contempt for people less fortunate. The inability to recognize that her insults revealed more about her character than about my cooking. At that moment, listening to my daughter dismiss not just Margaret's recipes, but the very possibility that they might have value, I felt the last vestiges of doubt leave me. I would sell the recipes to Antonio, not as punishment for Sophia, but as liberation from myself and proper stewardship of Margaret's legacy. My daughter had made her choice, repeatedly and emphatically.
She had chosen contempt over curiosity, dismissal over appreciation, cruelty over kindness. Now it was time for me to make my choice. The next morning, I called Antonio and accepted his offer. The contracts were signed within days, and within a month, Margaret's recipes would begin their new life at Nana's table, prepared by skilled chefs who understood their cultural significance and served to customers who would appreciate their authentic flavors and traditional techniques. But I was not finished with Sophia. Her cruelty deserved a response, not out of spite, but as a matter of justice and education. She needed to understand the consequences of her words, the value of what she had so casually dismissed, and the character flaws her comments had revealed. The lesson I planned to teach her would be delivered with the same care and attention to detail that I had brought to preparing her rejected Thanksgiving dinner. But this time, I would not be the one left feeling diminished and dismissed. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal truths about family, respect, and the real value of traditions that connect us to our heritage and to each other. Sophia had chosen to see me as an embarrassment, my cooking as primitive, and my dedication to family recipes as outdated foolishness. Soon, she would discover just how wrong she had been about all of it. The transformation from hurt father to determined man seeking justice had been gradual but complete. Margaret's recipes were about to find their proper home, and my daughter was about to learn a lesson about respect that was long overdue. The only question remaining was whether she would be capable of learning from the experience or if her arrogance would blind her to the truth even when it was presented with undeniable clarity. 3 months had passed since I signed the contracts with Antonio, and the transformation had been remarkable. Not just in my bank account, though the $50,000 had certainly provided welcome security, but in my sense of purpose and self-worth. Margaret's recipes were now being prepared nightly at Nana's table, served to customers who appreciated their authentic flavors and rich history. Antonio had been true to his word, presenting each dish with the story of its origins and honoring Margaret's memory with every plate that left the kitchen. The success had been immediate and overwhelming. Food critics from 3 major newspapers had reviewed the restaurant within weeks of launching what they called the heritage menu, praising the authenticity and emotional depth of dishes that told the story of Italian-American immigration through taste and tradition. One review described Margaret's pumpkin pie as a masterpiece of cultural fusion, a dish that honored both Italian technique and American ingredients while creating something entirely unique and deeply satisfying. But the real validation came from customers themselves. Antonio forwarded me dozens of emails from people who had eaten at Nana's table and been moved by the food. Diners who recognized in Margaret's recipes the same kind of love and tradition they remembered from their own grandmother's kitchens. One woman wrote that eating the ravioli had brought her to tears because it tasted exactly like the dish her Italian grandmother had made for Sunday dinners 40 years earlier. I had started working at the restaurant 2 days a week, not out of financial necessity, but because Antonio valued my knowledge of the original preparation methods, and because I found deep satisfaction in seeing Margaret's recipes brought to life by skilled professional cooks. The young chefs treated me with respect and genuine curiosity, asking detailed questions about techniques and family history, understanding they were learning more than just cooking, but cultural preservation. During these months, I had not heard from Sophia. Not a phone call, not a text message, not even a holiday card. Her silence spoke volumes about her priorities and values, confirming what I had come to understand about our relationship. She had been interested in me only as long as I remained predictable and accommodating, willing to absorb her criticism and accept her version of reality without complaint or resistance. But her silence would not last much longer. Antonio had been planning something special, a celebration of the heritage menu's success that would attract media attention and further establish Nana's table as a destination for authentic Italian-American cuisine. He had arranged for a feature article in Metropolitan Food magazine, complete with photographs and an interview about the stories behind the recipes. The article would be published in the spring issue with national distribution and significant online presence. More importantly, Antonio had planned an exclusive tasting event for influential food writers, local celebrities, and prominent community members. The event would showcase all of Margaret's recipes, prepared exactly as she had taught me, with me present to share the family history behind each dish. It was scheduled for Saturday evening in March. Antonio had promised it would be an unforgettable celebration of traditional cooking and cultural heritage. When he showed me the guest list, I was both impressed and slightly nervous. Restaurant critics from major publications, successful local business owners, political figures, and several prominent attorneys were invited. The event would clearly be well attended by exactly the kind of sophisticated, successful people that Sophia and Derek considered their peers. As the date approached, I found myself thinking more frequently about my daughter and wondering if she might somehow hear about the article or the event. Part of me hoped she would remain oblivious, allowing me to enjoy this triumph without the complication of her potential reaction. But another part of me, the part that still carried hurt from her cruel words, wanted her to discover exactly how wrong she had been about the value of my cooking and Margaret's recipes. The decision I made still surprises me when I think about it. Rather than leaving discovery to chance, I chose to ensure that Sophia would learn about the heritage menu and understand the magnitude of her mistake. Not through direct communication, which would have allowed her to dismiss or rationalize the information, but through a more subtle and ultimately more powerful method. I arranged for Derek to receive an invitation to the tasting event. Through my connections at the restaurant, I learned that Derek's law firm had recently begun representing several upscale restaurants in licensing and contract negotiations. Antonio was genuinely interested in legal counsel for expanding the heritage menu concept to other locations, making Derek's presence at the event professionally relevant as well as personally significant.
The invitation was sent through proper channels, from Antonio's office to Derek's firm, presenting the event as a business networking opportunity with potential for future professional relationship. There was no mention of my connection to the evening or my role in developing the heritage menu. From Derek's perspective, it would appear to be an exclusive invitation to a high-profile culinary event hosted by one of the city's most successful restaurants. I knew that Derek and Sophia rarely missed opportunities to attend prestigious social events, especially ones that might enhance their professional networking or social status. The guest list alone would be enough to ensure their attendance, and the promise of exceptional food and wine would seal their decision. As the date approached, I found myself oscillating between anticipation and anxiety. Part of me looked forward to the moment when Sophia would taste her grandmother's recipes, prepared by master chefs and served in elegant surroundings, when she would realize that the food she had dismissed as fit only for homeless people was being celebrated by the very social circle she aspired to impress. But another part of me worried about the potential confrontation, the possibility that she might create a scene or find some way to diminish what should be a celebration of Margaret's legacy. Bernie, who had become a close friend and confidant during these months, urged me to focus on the positive aspects of the evening rather than my daughter's potential reaction. The event is about honoring your wife's memory and celebrating the success of her recipes, he reminded me. Whatever your daughter's response, that truth remains unchanged. Don't let her past cruelty overshadow your current triumph. His advice was sound, but I could not entirely suppress my curiosity about how Sophia would handle the revelation that her father's supposedly inadequate cooking had become the foundation for a celebrated restaurant menu. Would she be capable of recognizing her mistake and perhaps even feeling pride in her family's heritage? Or would she find some way to rationalize or minimize the achievement, protecting her ego at the expense of truth and family connection? The morning of the event dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp spring weather that made everything feel possible and promising. I spent the day at the restaurant, working with Antonio and his staff to ensure that every detail was perfect. We reviewed each recipe one final time, discussed the stories I would share about Margaret and her grandmother, and arranged the timing so that each dish would be presented at its optimal temperature and appearance. The restaurant looked magnificent, transformed for the evening into something resembling a combination of elegant dinner party and culinary showcase. Each table was set with crisp white linens, fresh flowers, and carefully selected wine pairings for each course. Soft lighting created an atmosphere of warmth and sophistication, while large photographs of Margaret's handwritten recipe cards were displayed throughout the dining room, honoring her memory and emphasizing the authentic, family-based nature of the heritage menu. As guests began arriving at 6 o'clock, I positioned myself near the kitchen, where I could observe the dining room without being immediately visible to new arrivals. I wanted to see Sophia and Derek enter, to gauge their initial reaction to the setting and perhaps their recognition of the recipe cards displayed on the walls. They arrived fashionably late, as I had expected, making an entrance that demonstrated their confidence and social status. Sophia looked stunning in a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months, while Derek wore an impeccably tailored dark suit that proclaimed his professional success to anyone who cared to notice. They moved through the room with practiced ease, greeting other guests with the sort of polished charm that came from years of attending similar events. I watched as they examined the recipe cards, leaning close to read Margaret's handwriting, and I could see Sophia's expression change from casual interest to puzzled recognition. She pointed something out to Derek, and they both looked more closely at one of the cards, clearly trying to process what they were seeing. The evening began with cocktails and appetizers, featuring Margaret's famous meatballs, prepared exactly as she had taught me, but presented with elegant garnishes and professional plating. I emerged from the kitchen to begin sharing the stories behind the recipes, explaining how Margaret's grandmother had adapted traditional Sicilian techniques to American ingredients, how each dish represented not just a meal, but a piece of family history and cultural preservation. The guests were captivated, asking thoughtful questions about immigration history, cooking techniques, and the process of cultural adaptation that these recipes represented. Several food writers took notes, clearly recognizing the human interest story that connected personal family history to larger themes of American immigration and cultural preservation. Throughout my presentation, I was acutely aware of Sophia and Derek at their table. Derek appeared genuinely interested in the culinary history I was sharing, nodding appreciatively and occasionally making comments to other guests at their table. But Sophia looked increasingly uncomfortable, her face displaying a mixture of confusion, recognition, and growing unease as she began to understand the connection between these celebrated recipes and her own family history. The second course featured Margaret's ravioli, each piece handmade that afternoon using her traditional technique and filled with ricotta and herbs according to her exact specifications. As guests savored the delicate pasta and rich filling, I shared the story of how Margaret had learned this recipe from her grandmother, how it had been served at every important family celebration, how it represented the continuation of traditions that connected our family to its Sicilian roots. It was during this course that I noticed Sophia excuse herself from the table and step outside, probably needing air or perhaps wanting privacy to process what she was experiencing. Derek remained at the table, continuing to enjoy his meal and engage in conversation with other guests, apparently unaware of his wife's distress. The main course featured Margaret's turkey recipe, the same preparation I had used for Thanksgiving dinner 3 months earlier, but this time accompanied with professional sides and presented with the sort of elegant garnishes that transformed familiar flavors into restaurant-quality cuisine. The guests responded with obvious pleasure, many commenting that the turkey was the most flavorful and perfectly prepared they had ever experienced. As I described the technique Margaret had developed for ensuring moist, flavorful meat and crispy skin, I could see Sophia through the window, pacing on the sidewalk with her phone pressed to her ear. She appeared to be having an intense conversation, her body language suggesting agitation and frustration. Whatever she was discussing, it was clearly not a pleasant social call. She returned to the table just as dessert was being served, Margaret's legendary pumpkin pie, presented with vanilla bean ice cream and a delicate caramel sauce that enhanced rather than the traditional flavors. This was the moment I had been anticipating most, watching Sophia taste the very dessert she had rejected at Thanksgiving, now prepared by master chefs and served to an appreciative audience of sophisticated diners. The guests' response to the pie exceeded even Antonio's expectations. Several people audibly sighed with pleasure at their first taste, and one food critic actually closed her eyes to better focus on the complex blend of spices and textures. The conversation at every table focused on the exceptional quality of the dessert, with many guests declaring it the finest pumpkin pie they had ever experienced. As I concluded the evening with the story of Margaret's secret ingredient and the 4 generations of refinement that had perfected this recipe, I watched Sophia take a small bite of her slice. Her expression was impossible to read, a mixture of recognition, disbelief, and what might have been embarrassment or regret. She set down her fork after that single taste and did not return to the dessert, though I noticed that Derek finished his entire portion with obvious enjoyment. The evening concluded with enthusiastic applause and numerous requests for business cards and contact information. Several guests approached me personally to express their appreciation for the stories and the exceptional quality of the food, with many asking about the possibility of purchasing copies of Margaret's recipes for their own use. The food writers promised positive coverage, and 2 potential investors expressed interest in helping Antonio expand the heritage menu concept to additional locations. As guests began departing, I positioned myself near the entrance to thank them for attending and to answer any final questions about the recipes or family history. This location also allowed me to observe Sophia and Derek as they prepared to leave, to see whether they would acknowledge my presence or attempt to depart without confrontation. They were among the last to leave, lingering at their table in what appeared to be intense, quiet conversation.
When they finally stood to go, Derek headed directly toward the exit while Sophia hung back, clearly wrestling with some internal conflict about whether to approach me. The decision was made for her when Derek paused at the door and noticed that she was not beside him. He looked back, saw me standing near the entrance, and his expression changed as recognition finally dawned. The realization that I was not just a guest at this event, but the source of the celebrated recipes, the father-in-law whose cooking he had been praising to other guests throughout the evening, transformed his confident demeanor into obvious discomfort. "Walter," he said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that I had never heard from him before, "I didn't realize you were involved with this restaurant." I could see Sophia approaching reluctantly, her face pale and her usual confidence notably absent. For the first time in years, my daughter looked genuinely unsure of herself, stripped of the casual arrogance that typically characterized her interactions with me. "Good evening, Sophia," I said, calmly maintaining the same polite tone I had used with all the other guests throughout the evening. "I hope you enjoyed dinner." She stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling to find words that might address the magnitude of the situation she found herself in. The recipes that had been celebrated throughout the evening, praised by food critics and sophisticated diners, prepared by master chefs and served in elegant surroundings, were the same ones she had dismissed 3 months earlier as the cooking of homeless people. "Dad," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "I had no idea that you were... these recipes were Mom's recipes, weren't they?" "Yes," I confirmed. "They were your mother's recipes, the same ones I prepared for Thanksgiving dinner, the same ones you compared to the cooking of homeless people." The words hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of her cruel judgment and the undeniable evidence of how wrong she had been. Derek looked profoundly uncomfortable, clearly recognizing the implications of what his wife had said and how it reflected on both of them. "I didn't understand," Sophia said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I didn't realize that the recipes were so... the food tonight was extraordinary. The pumpkin pie was incredible. I've never tasted anything like it." "It was exactly the same recipe," I replied evenly, "prepared exactly the same way. The only difference was the presentation and the setting. The food itself was identical to what you rejected at Thanksgiving." She had no response to this, no way to rationalize or minimize the truth that her dismissive attitude had been based not on the quality of the food, but on her preconceptions and prejudices. She had been incapable of recognizing excellence when it was served in her father's dining room, but was perfectly able to appreciate it when presented in a prestigious restaurant setting. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Derek attempted to salvage the situation. "Walter," he said, "we had no idea about your involvement with the restaurant or the success of the heritage menu. Congratulations on what appears to be a very successful venture." "Thank you," I replied, though my attention remained focused on Sophia, who was clearly struggling to process the full implications of what she had discovered. "I need to ask you something, Dad," she said finally, her voice stronger but still uncertain. "Did you arrange for us to be invited tonight? Did you want us to find out about the restaurant and the recipes this way?" It was a perceptive question, one that acknowledged the possibility that this revelation was not accidental but orchestrated. I considered my response carefully, wanting to be truthful while maintaining my dignity and making clear the lesson I had intended to teach. "Antonio needed legal counsel for expanding the heritage menu concept," I said. "Your husband's firm has experience with restaurant licensing and contracts. The invitation was legitimate and professionally appropriate. Whether you attended was your choice." This was technically true, though it avoided addressing the deeper question of my motivations and intentions. Sophia was intelligent enough to recognize the partial nature of my answer, but she was also in no position to demand fuller disclosure or to criticize my methods. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said suddenly, the words coming out in a rush as if she had been building up courage to speak them. "I'm sorry for what I said at Thanksgiving. It was cruel and wrong, and I should have recognized the effort and love you put into that meal. I should have appreciated Mom's recipes and the tradition they represented." The apology was more than I had expected, and I could see that it was genuine, prompted not just by social embarrassment, but by real recognition of her mistake. However, it also came only after she had been forced to confront undeniable evidence of her error, only after her judgment had been publicly contradicted by people whose opinions she respected. "I appreciate your apology, Sophia, but I want you to understand something important. The problem wasn't just that you didn't like the food. The problem was how you chose to express your opinion, comparing my cooking to that of homeless people as if their circumstances made them less worthy of respect or dignity." She winced at the reminder, clearly understanding now how revealing that comment had been about her character and values. Derek placed a protective hand on her shoulder, but his expression suggested that he too recognized the ugliness of what she had said. "Your mother volunteered at the food bank for 15 years. She cooked for people experiencing hardship, and she did it with the same care and attention she brought to feeding her own family."
The idea that someone's circumstances might make their food less worthy would have horrified her. Sophia was crying now, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, ruining her perfect appearance, but perhaps revealing something more authentic underneath. I could see that my words were having an impact, forcing her to confront not only her error in judgment about the food, but her broader attitude toward people less fortunate than herself. "I'm sorry, Dad," she repeated, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I hurt you, and I know what I said was wrong in so many ways. Can you forgive me? Can we find a way to repair what I damaged?" The question hung between us, carrying the weight of years of growing distance and accumulated disappointments. Part of me wanted to embrace her immediately, to accept her apology and pretend that everything could return to the way it had been before Thanksgiving. But I knew that forgiveness without consequences would teach nothing, that reconciliation without genuine change would only postpone the next crisis. "Forgiveness is possible, Sophia," I said carefully, "but rebuilding trust takes time and consistent behavior. You'll need to demonstrate that you've learned from this experience, that you understand not just that you were wrong about the recipes, but that your attitude toward people facing hardship was cruel and unacceptable." She nodded eagerly, apparently willing to accept whatever conditions I might set for reconciliation. Derek also nodded, perhaps recognizing that his wife's behavior reflected poorly on both of them and needed addressing. "I'd like to learn Mom's recipes," she said suddenly. "I know I rejected them before, but now I understand their value. Would you be willing to teach me?" The request surprised me, both because it seemed genuine and because it represented exactly the kind of interest in family heritage that Margaret had hoped Sophia would eventually develop. However, I was also cautious about moving too quickly, about assuming that one evening's embarrassment had fundamentally changed my daughter's character. "We can discuss that possibility," I said carefully, But first, I'd like you to volunteer with me at the food bank for a few Saturdays. I want you to meet the people you so casually dismissed, to understand that circumstances don't determine a person's worth or dignity." The suggestion clearly made her uncomfortable, which confirmed that it was exactly what she needed to do. Sophia's worldview had been shaped by privilege and success, insulating her from the realities that less fortunate people faced daily. Exposure to those realities might help her develop the empathy and humility that her cruel comment had revealed she lacked. "Okay," she agreed after a moment's hesitation. "If that's what you think would be helpful, I'm willing to do it." The evening concluded with tentative plans for Sophia to join me at the St. Andrew's Community Center the following Saturday to begin her education in compassion and service. Derek promised to research the legal requirements for expanding the heritage menu concept, potentially turning our family crisis into a business opportunity. And I found myself cautiously optimistic that the painful lessons of the past few months might ultimately lead to healing and renewed family connection. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me from devastation at Thanksgiving to triumph at this evening's event. Margaret's recipes had indeed found their proper home, appreciated by people who understood their value and prepared by chefs who respected their tradition. My daughter had been forced to confront the cruelty of her words and the emptiness of her prejudices, and I had discovered that preserving family legacy sometimes requires the courage to share it beyond the family, to find people who will treasure what family members might reject or dismiss. The relationship between Sophia and me would need careful rebuilding, based on mutual respect rather than parental accommodation. She would need to demonstrate genuine change, not just apologetic words, if she wanted to reclaim her connection to family heritage and tradition. But for the first time in months, I felt hopeful that such rebuilding might be possible, that the lessons of this evening might lead to something stronger and more authentic than what we had lost. Over the following months, Sophia did indeed join me at the food bank, initially reluctant, but gradually becoming more engaged as she discovered the stories and struggles of people she had previously dismissed as unworthy of consideration. She learned to prepare meals for hundreds of people, to stretch limited ingredients into satisfying dishes, to treat every person we served with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. The experience changed her in ways that extended far beyond her attitude toward cooking or her relationship with me. She began volunteering with other community organizations, using her professional skills to help people navigate legal and financial systems. She developed friendships with people she never would have encountered in her privileged social circle, learning to value individuals for their character rather than their economic status. Most importantly, she began learning Margaret's recipes not as obligations to be endured, but as treasures to be preserved and shared. Each cooking lesson became an opportunity to discuss family history, to remember Margaret's values and principles, to understand how food preparation could be an expression of love and cultural preservation. The heritage menu at Nana's table continued to thrive, eventually expanding to 3 additional locations and inspiring other restaurants to develop their own family recipe programs. The Metropolitan Food Magazine article brought national attention to the concept of preserving family culinary traditions through professional restaurant partnerships, leading to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that kept me busier and more fulfilled than I had been in years. But the real success was the gradual healing of my relationship with Sophia, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than one-sided accommodation. She never again dismissed my cooking or compared it unfavorably to anything, having learned to appreciate not just the technical skill involved, but the love and tradition that transformed simple ingredients into expressions of family heritage. The cruel words that started this entire journey became a painful but necessary catalyst for growth, understanding, and ultimately, reconciliation based on truth rather than politeness. Margaret's recipes had indeed survived and thrived, finding appreciation among people who understood their true worth while teaching valuable lessons about respect, dignity, and the real meaning of family legacy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.